Okay, we're going to just pick right back up where we were at. One thing, I actually didn't measure it because I just got access to this morning, so I didn't have a lot of time to do testing. And so I kind of added this at the last minute, but just from eyeballing it, it seems to me that the contrast requirement for this link text could not possibly be met for WCAG 2.0, right? Because this link is not underlined, it would have to have a 3-to-1 contrast difference between this text. And if you give it that contrast difference, you can't then have sufficient contrast between the white and the background and whatever color you put here and the background. You can't meet all three of those requirements because of the kind of darker green background color. So does that mean you have to change your background color? I don't know. That's a big battle to fight, right? Easiest solution, underline the link, right? Easiest solution of all. Now, there are probably some reasons why you haven't. So you weigh those, right? You just figure out what the balance is. If you can get close to the 3-to-1, then maybe you call that good. I know that makes Kathy squirm because it's nice having good absolutes, but common sense is good, and accessibility most important of all. Okay, next on our list here is test content scaling. I think we already covered this pretty well. We recommend increasing the text size in your web browser to 150%. We noted that WCAG requires 200%. Of note, in WCAG 2.0, buried in all of those 100 pages of documentation, there is a technique for this success criteria of WCAG 2.0 that says that zooming is sufficient. Meaning, if you zoom your page, it is sufficient. I didn't know about this. I'll be honest. I consider myself pretty up to date on WCAG. I didn't know that was buried in there until about a week ago. The language is just really obscure. But basically the way that it's worded in WCAG is, we know that text sizing is important. We strongly encourage you to support text sizing. But if you do zooming instead, you can consider that a pass of the success criteria. But hey, we know text sizing is important. Really what they did in WCAG is they took two different needs for users. Some users increase their text size, some users zoom, and they took both of them and lumped them into one place at a 200% requirement. It would be much better to say, well, let's have 150% for text and 300% for zoom, which is probably a little more reasonable, really, when it comes to zoom. The things should maintain readability when they're increased, probably more than 200%, because that would be fairly common. 300 or 400% is not uncommon for somebody using a screen enlarger or page zoom. 200% is very, very unlikely for somebody that's using text sizing. 150% really is about the maximum. So I don't know. That might be just something to consider in your own implementation. So you can do this on your site, in your browser. Again, you can test, I'm going to do Command plus or Control plus on most Windows browsers to increase the text size. Now the requirement is readability and functionality. Okay, it doesn't have to look the same. It might wrap, it might break your layout. That's okay as long as it's readable and functional. So that's about 200%, somewhere right in there.
You see the drop down. It's blocking the request.
Okay, over here. Okay, so that might be a case at about 200%. If I go one more, I think is where it really starts to fall apart. That's probably more than 200%. This is the type of thing you want to look out for, right? Where things clearly are not readable. We've probably lost some functionality. I maybe can't click on links or buttons because they've disappeared or are overlapping other elements. Okay? So it's pretty easy testing in your browser. This is just increasing the text size. You can also enable the zoom functionality to zoom the entire page. Pretty much impossible to fail anything. It's kind of nice to look at your page that way, but not really required, I guess, for evaluation or testing because it's pretty much impossible to fail. So again, is the page readable and usable? Even though it's not required at level AA, there's kind of a suggestion that you try to minimize horizontal scrolling. If I increase the text size one notch and I suddenly have to scroll horizontally, that's going to affect quite a few users, right? My mom, vision's not very good anymore. She bumps up the text size a little bit. If she has to scroll back and forth, that's going to be a usability issue. So there's kind of a suggestion that it doesn't mean it fails WCAG. It's just a suggestion there. So you want to try to minimize that horizontal scrolling. And then I talked about zoom. And in that example, at about 200 some odd %, which is pretty darn big, you can see that there are some issues on the site. Do you have to go fix these? No. Your page really supports pretty good. There might be some issues there. We saw the little menu drop down that appeared over some elements. Might be a few things you could do to maybe support a little bit better at about 150%, but overall, really looks pretty good. Okay, next is check keyboard accessibility. For the next little bit, we're going to kind of mush together. I really struggled with how to best structure this. We're going to mush together keyboard accessibility, ARIA, scripting, and a little bit of screen reader stuff. Because it just seemed to work better to cover it that way. Part of the reason why I'm putting in screen reader and ARIA is because they're so interrelated. When we talk about keyboard accessibility, that's where many, maybe even most of the accessibility issues for screen reader users come in, or with interactions, keyboard interaction with the page. So things to consider here. Navigate the site using only the keyboard. Really easy to test. Put the mouse away, tab, shift tab to navigate through links and form controls, enter to activate elements. Can you get to all of the functionality that's available to keyboard users? Is a skip navigation link available? So on your site, there generally is a skip to main content link. You can see it becomes visible after after I navigate to the PayPal logo. If I hit tab, skip to main content becomes visible. Hit tab again, it goes across the top bar. So you want to make sure, is it present? And probably most importantly, does it actually do what it's supposed to? In our experience, people quote us on this. I've seen people quote us on this. This is a rough estimate. Probably half of the skip to main content links on the web don't work. Remember it was this morning, I guess, the wheelchair ramp that goes halfway there, right? This is a case of a wheelchair ramp that doesn't get you everywhere you need to be. It's something that's presented for accessibility but doesn't actually work. The reason skip to main content links usually are broken are one of two reasons. Either they're hidden in a way that they cannot be accessed by the keyboard, often with CSS display none. If you use CSS display none on content, it cannot receive keyboard focus. You can't tab to it. So you have a skip to main content link that keyboard users can never get to, even though it's there entirely for keyboard users. Or the target in the page where that link navigates or jumps to has been lost. So at some point you built your template and you implemented the skip to main content link in it, and then the target where it would jump to down here, and then somebody tweaked it and got rid of the target but didn't skip or didn't test your skip to main content link to see if it was still working. You guys heard about the Target lawsuit? You guys heard about the Target lawsuit? Target.com, they were sued about over web accessibility. Turned into a class action lawsuit. They settled for about $12-13 million and agreed to make their website more accessible. Well, this is something that they did. And this isn't to pick on them, but they implemented skip to main content links on their website, and about a month after they implemented, somebody tweaked the code and they became broken. And for about 3 years, they had skip to main content links on their site that didn't work. It was a simple QA thing, a simple testing thing that apparently for years was overlooked. Other thing with skip links is make sure that it is at least visible on focus. If you don't have it visible at all times in the page, it has to be visible when it receives keyboard focus. That would be for sighted keyboard users. Often people say, well, I'll hide it off screen so that screen reader users can still activate it. So they'll hear skip to main content, then hit enter to jump to the main content. But if I'm a sighted keyboard user and the link it doesn't ever become visible, I don't know that it's there. So your site does a great job of that, right? I hit tab, it becomes visible in the page. Let me show you one of the potential issues with that is, I hope this works. WebAIM, I think this is right. Whoa. Shoot. I can't remember what it's called. Okay, never mind. I'll just explain it. I've got a little demo page. I can't remember where it is. One of the issues with hidden skip to main content links that become visible when they receive keyboard focus. On your page, if I'm a sighted keyboard user and I come to this page and I want to get to the main content, I'm not going to hit tab really slowly, go through every navigation link, or I'm not going to watch it. I'm going to go to town. I'm either going to start hitting tab really quick, or I'm going to hold it down and cycle through those links really quickly to get to what I'm looking for. Because the skip to main content link isn't visible by default, if I tab really quickly, I might miss that it showed up. Okay. One thing that, and we've got a little demo of this, we use a little bit of CSS3 transitions to animate that thing into and off the screen. So if I tab really quick, it pops into view, and then if I hit tab again, it actually takes like a second and fades out, or maybe slides down or slides up. So it makes it a little more visually distinctive. So it's always on the screen for at least like half a second or maybe 1 second, so it's easier to see. So just something, you don't have to do that, just something to consider. It might do a little enhancement. Oh, thank you. Yes, that's it. All right. Skip CSS3.
Yeah, that is.
There we go. Okay. So here's kind of a little example of this. If I hit tab, see how the skip to main content link kind of transitions in and then back out. So just kind of a little gimmicky maybe in this case, but it kind of demonstrates the advantage of keeping that on the screen and making it very visually distinctive. Okay, you also want to, with your keyboard, make sure the navigation order is logical. As I start hitting the tab key and it navigates through navigation, links, form controls, is it logical? Does it roughly follow the visual presentation order? And is a visible keyboard focus indicator / outline present? Okay, so as I tab, can I visually see which things have keyboard focus? This is often missed on web pages, very high impact on users. It is only a AA requirement, and it's something that's in your standard and we highly recommend. I want to talk a minute about heading and landmark structure. Having a good heading structure is great for a lot of reasons. It's really great for content. It's good for structure. It's good for development. Anytime somebody comes and says, "Oh, can you put this content on this home page or on this page?" it forces you to say, "Well, where does it fit in this page? What's the heading structure? Where is it most logical?" If it doesn't fit into a current area, maybe we need to create a new heading for that content. So it's really good at just supporting a structured approach to content presentation. And it's great for keyboard accessibility. For screen reader users, I can generally hit the H key to navigate through headings. I can hit 1, 2, or 3 keys to navigate through first level headings, second level headings, third level headings. That's what we do visually. If you come to a big, long page, you scroll real fast and look for big, bold text, right? Gives you a good visual presentation. Well, what's this page about? What are the major areas? What are the sub areas within this? Screen reader users can do the same thing if you use True Heading Searcher. They navigate through and through the headings to get an idea of the structure and content of that page. So for heading structure, what we recommend is one H1 per page. That generally contains the document title, the biggest, boldest text at the top of the page. This is not a WCAG requirement. Okay, WCAG actually does not have any requirement. Well, probably does not. It's a little bit subjective. Probably does not have any requirements for actually having heading levels that do anything. What WCAG requires is if you have big, bold text that's presented as a heading, it must be a heading. It doesn't say it has to be a heading of the appropriate level. Okay? But good heading levels are important. With that said, any heading level for a heading is more important than having no headings at all. Okay? If all of your headings on your page are H1s, or all of them, they jump around from H1 to H6, that's going to be better than having no headings at all. Okay, I can hit the H key and just cycle through the headings. Having a good heading structure, however, is better. So let's do that, even though technically it probably is not a WCAG requirement. We recommend you don't skip over heading levels, so you wouldn't jump from, say, an H2 to an H4. You'd always have an H3 after an H2. You can jump from, say, an H4 and then your next heading be an H2. You can jump backwards levels. You wouldn't want to skip over heading levels. You can start your page with an H2. Your H1 does not have to be your first heading on your page. Often it would be that way. You might have headings for main navigation, search, side navigation, and then your main H1 at the beginning of your main content. That's really helpful for navigation. If your H1 is your main content title, I can hit the 1 key and I'm right at your main content. Okay, on every page, that's really, really useful for navigation.
So, for like, let's say your main navigation section.
Mm-hmm.
So you could denote that with HTML5 and with ARIA. So do you recommend using a heading and hiding it visually, or like your main navigation for the footer?
Okay. Not necessarily. The question is, do you need to have headings for all of your page sections? Some things like navigation. No, not necessarily. If you already have a heading, then yes. If you have a heading above your sidebar, big text that describes what that sidebar is, and that's a heading. You want to mark it up that way. You don't want to add headings arbitrarily. Now, there are a few cases where maybe adding a heading but having it hidden off screen for screen reader users can really be beneficial. Something like a sidebar where visually it's separate from your main content. You visually know this is something separate. It's a separate section because of the visual presentation, even though there may not be a heading that identifies that. That might be a good place for a heading that's in the page but hidden off screen. Then a screen reader user can navigate to that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that might be a good case. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be a great candidate for a hidden heading. Putting it visually in the page probably doesn't make sense, but visually you can tell it's offset. It's its own section because of the visual design. So yeah, that'd be a good case. Something like navigation and footer. I don't know. You mentioned the word HTML5. With HTML5, nav and footer are sectioning elements, and kind of by definition in HTML5 they're supposed to have a heading to identify kind of what that block level element is. So it's been suggested for HTML5 it's good practice to have the first thing in, say, nav, or the first thing in footer be a heading to identify that. Essentially, the way it's supposed to work is if you have multiple navs in your page, if each one has a heading, they can be identified differently based on that heading level that begins that section. You don't have to. It's just kind of set up to work that way. I wouldn't force it. If it makes sense, you're good to go. One thing you do need to be careful with heading structures is sometimes it becomes really hard because many of your headings are going to be in your template. Then you're going to have headings in your content itself. And let's say you have if your template has your sidebar over here, right, your right-hand sidebar, and you put a heading in there, what heading level should you make it? Well, it's really hard to know without knowing what the heading structure of the content is. If you start it with an H3, make that an H2, and your document content has H1s and H2s, can't imagine this. I know it's hard to understand. So your sidebar, right sidebar, begins with an H3. And your document content has an H1, then an H2, then an H2. That document structure suggests that the H3, which comes in the source code after the H2, is part of the content under that last H2. Does that make sense? It kind of suggests that the sidebar is part of whatever the last heading was in the document. If you start it with an H3, does that make sense?
Yeah, well, the sidebar is not really, it's not part of the
Yeah.
main template.
Right.
The header and footer.
Right.
So, yeah, but we do have some other issues with other
Yeah.
within the content.
Yeah, it just gets really tricky when you're dealing with template headings and content headings to make sure you have appropriate leveled ones. Sometimes you just have to do the best that you can. Typically, something like start sidebar would probably be an H2. Document title and H2s, H3s, whatever in your content. Then kind of the next level up would be an H2 for your sidebar. So just doesn't always work perfectly. And it's not the end of the world if it doesn't work. Again, any level heading is better than no heading at all. With HTML5, that kind of changes all of the rules for headings. I could spend an hour talking about HTML5 outlining and sectioning elements and how that works. It gets really complex. Short version is that the headings you use in your markup may be very different than the headings outline that's presented to the users. It's actually can be very, very powerful for accessibility, but from a development and from a QA perspective, it's going to make things real interesting. I don't know if you're going to HTML5. So, I know right now it isn't HTML5, but you will. I know you will eventually. So just know it's going to eventually change the rules a little bit. It'll become easier in some ways because the misordering of headings actually matters less in HTML5, but the overall structure of block level elements matters a whole lot more. So anyway, I won't go into the details. It gets really ugly and complex. But just know that with it, when you go to HTML5, you're going to have to analyze not only your heading structure, but also the presented outline of that page, which can be very different, and make sure the outline makes sense, because that's what the user gets. And then ARIA landmarks, we talked about those. These are really easy to add. Just add a role equals some landmark identifier to two elements on your page. Your site, the site I looked at does have landmarks, which is great. Almost every page should probably have role equals main. Even if you transition to HTML5, HTML5 has nav, which is the same as role equals navigation. It has footer, which is the same as role equals content info. It has aside element, which is the same as role equals complementary. So you can see how this works. So we have ARIA landmarks that map to HTML5 elements. For a screen reader user, they'd be presented identically, right? Except for main. That's the exception. So nav in HTML5 eventually will be presented the same thing in the same way as div role equals navigation. They're both navigation. They both have the same role, except there is no default. There's no main element in HTML5. So almost all of your pages should probably have role equals main. Should probably be part of the template. Should probably be just before your H1. Should probably be at about the same place as your skip to main content link jumps to. Not always, but that's generally a pretty good guide. And have that in your page. Greatly facilitates keyboard, especially screen reader accessibility. Generally, role of navigation would, that's not entirely true also, kind of for more site level navigation blocks. Now, if you have an internal like table of contents, that would be probably be a navigation element for the page itself. Yeah, you want to balance a little bit. Now, one thing you can do in ARIA is you can provide a label for elements. So you can add role equals navigation and either ARIA labeled by and point to an element, say a heading, or ARIA label equals main navigation. And that would identify them differently. So with landmark roles, I can hit generally in screen readers, I can hit the semicolon key to navigate through the landmarks on the page. Yeah, and if you have 15 navigation roles, I'm going to have to navigate through all of those, and all of them are going to read navigation, 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 navigation. But if I add a label to them, it might read main navigation, secondary navigation, in-page navigation, footer links. You can add a label to those to describe them individually, which I would recommend if you have more than probably a couple. So yeah, either ARIA label equals whatever the value is, or if you already have a heading that describes it in the page, ARIA labeled by equals that points to that heading. Yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing on another site. Other questions about that? Okay. Few other things to be careful with. Be careful when default form control behavior is modified. Users expect form controls to always work the same, right? Example of this might be auto tabbing, right? A telephone number, you type in the first 3 different fields, you type in the first 3 digits and automatically focuses you to the next one. You know, if I'm a keyboard user, I'm very used to typing 3 and hitting tab. If you've already tabbed me, I'm now in the last field. You're all nodding your heads like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, we see those things all the time. Don't do your users favors. Can be really frustrating, especially frustrating if I am a screen reader user and I don't see that change has occurred. I can really get out of sync with what's happening there. With things like auto-tabbing, an example that we saw on a site had 3 fields, or had a area code field, 3 numbers. As soon as you typed in 3 numbers, it automatically advanced to the next field. Well, if you were a keyboard user, if you hit Shift-Tab and tried to go back into that field, as soon as focus was set into that field, the scripting said, hey, there are 3 numbers in this field. Let's advance them to the next one. If you clicked in it, it was just fine. But as a keyboard user, you couldn't go back to edit that field. Okay, as soon as you went back, it automatically advanced you for it. So those are the types of things you would need to be careful with anytime you change default form control behavior. Jump menus is another one where you take a select menu and you open a select menu, click on an item, and it automatically takes you to another web page. Select menus aren't by default navigation elements, right? You just select an item from there. So be real careful with that. Anytime you change default form control behavior, be really, really careful with that. Make sure it's clear to the user what's happening. Use buttons and links appropriately. We see this a lot. It can really be fairly significant for screen reader users. Users expect buttons to perform functions or submit form information. They expect links to simply take them to another web page. Okay, so an example might be a complex search form. If I'm using a screen reader and I fill out this complex search form and I hit tab and I hear search link, and that's actually the button to submit the search form, but it's actually a link in your markup. I hear search link, I think, I don't want to go to the search page. I don't want to go to a link about search. I want to submit the form I just filled out, right? There's a mismatch in what's being presented to me as a link. Now, you probably have styled that link to look like a button. So visually, it looks like a button, but for the screen reader, it's presented as a link. The opposite can be true. If you have a search search button on your page, and all it does is take you to the search page, that should be a link, not a button, right? If I come to a search button, I'm going to say, well, where's the form that I fill out to submit search? So use links and buttons appropriately. We'll show in a minute how you can use ARIA if, in that case where you have a link, if it is a link and it's styled to look like a button, you can use ARIA to have it be presented as a button rather than as a link. Dialog boxes are an interesting issue. If you have modal dialogues, right, modal dialogues meaning you have to interact with the dialogue, the rest of the page is usually kind of grayed out or inactive. If you have a modal dialogue, it has to be keyboard modal, meaning if you open that dialogue, consider if you're a screen reader user, you activate a link, it opens up a dialogue, I read through the dialogue. If I continue reading with my screen reader or hit the tab key, I should not be able to leave that dialogue window. If I can get back to the underlying page and start navigating or reading or interacting with the underlying page, yet it's grayed out, and nobody else can interact with it, that's going to be a problem. Especially, even if I'm a sighted keyboard user, if I start hitting the tab key and I'm navigating through this page that's covered by a modal dialogue, you see how that'd be really confusing? So modal dialogues need to maintain keyboard focus. If I'm reading or tabbing with the keyboard, it should maintain within that element. In HTML5, there's a new proposal for a modal attribute, essentially that would identify something as being modal, and the browser would do all that work for you, which will be cool. I can't wait for that. So you don't have to do the work to maintain keyboard focus or screen reader focus. The browser would do that work for you. It would essentially disable the rest of the page. But for now, you have to do that yourself with scripting. You have to maintain focus within that. Now, if it's a non-modal dialogue, meaning it's a dialogue that opens, and if you click somewhere else in the page, it just goes away, then it should also close when the keyboard user goes away from it. Okay? So if it's a non-modal dialogue, if I read through it, and maybe if I hit tab and go past that dialogue and go back to the page, the dialogue should probably close. It means I'm done with it. I'm no longer reading in it. Treat it the same way as I do mouse users. If it's a mouse modal, make it keyboard modal. If it's not mouse modal, meaning I can dismiss it just by clicking anywhere else in the page, should do the same when keyboard focus is lost from that dialogue. Also, the escape key should usually close menus, dialogues, etc. Almost any time you see a close link or button, usually in the top right or at the bottom, usually the escape key should do the same thing. pretty easy to add to your scripting. Things like complex menus, like flyout menus, you get 2 or 3 levels deep. Usually escape should move you up 1 level. Okay, and we'll get to that in a little more detail in just a minute. Also for QA, you want to test form validation and error recovery. When we talk about forms, usually just the standard form labeling is what we want to use whenever possible, and then you can use ARIA to add additional labels or additional labeling or descriptions to a form field. A real benefit of using the label element for a form label is if I click on the label, it will set focus into the field itself. That's an easy way to test, by the way. If form fields are properly labeled, just click on the text that's next to them. If the form field gets focused or becomes activated, then I know it's properly labeled, or probably is properly labeled. That's especially helpful for things like radio buttons and checkboxes that are really small. I have a friend that has cerebral palsy. My mouth is getting tired, apparently. He has tremors in his hands. It's really hard for him to track down and click right on a checkbox. If you use appropriate labeling, he can click anywhere on the text label and the checkbox will become focused or activated. Where you can't use a label alone, that's where ARIA can come into play. So you want to test, are error prevention and recovery mechanisms present, or are they easy to use? You want to ask a question about client-side validation, which is great for usability. You just need to be careful you're not relying on it entirely. What if the user disables JavaScript? And make sure any of those types of interactions, errors, alerts, things like that that come with client-side validation are accessible. With HTML5, this is going to become both better and worse because we have a lot of new input types for HTML5, which are great. You can do things like type equals URL, type equals telephone, type equals email, and it would provide feedback and validation to ensure the user puts in those appropriate data types into the fields. The idea is that the browser will provide all of that necessary accessibility. Okay. And so eventually that's going to be really nice. In the meantime, you're going to have to still handle that validation and error recovery on your own. There are 3 ARIA attributes that are very, very useful when it comes to form accessibility. ARIA required, ARIA invalid, and ARIA disabled. So ARIA required does what it sounds like. Identifies required form fields as required. So just if you add input, ARIA-required equals true, when a screen reader user gets to that form field, it reads the word required. Easy to add. Something you can add right now to your forms and would identify required form fields as being required. ARIA-invalid will identify broken or errant form fields. So if you submit a form and there are form fields that have issues with them, often we do kind of a visual presentation. We might do like a red border on the text boxes that are broken that they need to address. Well, if it's purely color, that's great for me as a sighted user. I can really easily see what I need to go fix, but for a screen reader user, that's more difficult. If I add ARIA-invalid equals true, as I navigate to that form field, I'll usually read the word invalid to identify that, hey, this is the thing you need to fix. And then ARIA disabled would identify a disabled form field. This is really, really useful if you're using just visual styling to disable form controls. HTML has a disabled attribute. You can do like input disabled equals disabled. The issue with using HTML disabled is that it removes that control from the keyboard navigation. Okay, I can't tab to a disabled form control that uses the HTML disabled element. That can be an issue. Let's say you have a form and the button is disabled until you put in all of the required fields. Okay. Well, if I'm a screen reader user and I miss one of the required fields, I go looking for the submit button. I can't find it because it's marked as disabled in HTML. It's not, I can't tab to it. I can read to it, but I would expect a button to be in the keyboard navigation. So I can't find the button to know that there's an issue. So rather than using HTML disabled, you can do visual styling to make it look disabled and add ARIA-disabled equals true. Now it's in the tab order. I can tab to it, but it becomes read as, it reads the word disabled when I get to that button. So I know that there's an issue. I have to go back and fix something. Does that make sense? How that works? Okay, so generally a few methods for form validation and error recovery. One approach is you submit the form and the errors appear at the top. Okay. Oh, sorry, there was a problem with your form, and it might list out the errors, and then I can go down and actually find those errors and fix them. Sometimes something that we've seen implemented sometimes is actually links in that error message that I can activate a link. Say, maybe it says, sorry, you must enter your first name, and first name is a link. I can activate first name, sets focus down to the first name field, so I don't have to go find it. Just facilitates kind of getting through that recovery mode. Another method is alert and focus. So maybe I submit and I get some sort of prompt. Sorry, there was an error with your form. You must submit your first name. Maybe click OK. And then I'd want to probably set focus to that broken form field. That's another easy way to do this. Another one is inline errors, right? Submit it and suddenly the error messages show up in the form where they're at. This is a little more problematic. It's really great for usability, but it can be a little more difficult for a screen reader user, because if I activate the button and there are 3 errors in the form that suddenly become highlighted with red with an error message, what do I do with the screen reader user? Where do I send them? Do I just automatically set focus to the first broken form field? It's just a little harder, right? That might be a place where you might do an ARIA alert, just to inform the user that there were errors. Maybe they activate the button, focus stays on the button, but an ARIA alert says, hey, there were 3 errors with your form. Go back and fix them. I'd probably add ARIA-invalid attribute with scripting to the broken form fields, and I can easily go back and find them. Yeah, role of alert. Yeah, what role of alert does is it allows something to be read by a screen reader without setting focus to it. Okay. So I can have focus on the button. All I do is somewhere in the page. It doesn't even have to be visible in the page. It could be off screen. I give a block of content, role equals alert, and it will be read by a screen reader right now, even though focus is not set to it. It's pretty much the only way you can have content read by a screen reader without it currently being at that location. So very, very powerful. With that power, right, with all power comes responsibility. The downside of that is it's very, very intrusive, right? The screen reader will read it right now, so you would want to reserve that for the most important of alerts. Things that are really important that they need to know, and they can go back and find where those errors are at. So there's no real best approach here. Generally, what I've seen on the site is kind of the errors at the top approach. Is kind of usually an error message at the top. Sometimes you would set focus to that, especially if you're doing client-side scripting. So the user knows immediately. Even if you're not doing client-side validation, sometimes it's a good idea to set focus to that error message initially. Right? I might fill out this really long form and hit a button. If there's an error, I want to know right now if there's an error, especially if I'm a screen reader user. I shouldn't have to read all the way back through your navigation, find your main content, and try to find the, hey, you've done it, yay, it went somewhere, or no, sorry, try again error message. So setting focus directly to that can be useful. On our website, what we do with forms is we just have a class name, like class equals error, and in our scripting, it looks for that class name. If it's there, it sets focus to it when the page loads. So the first thing that's read is that error message. And we do the errors at the top approach, generally. So the errors at the top, focus is set to it. Hey, I know there are errors. I know what the errors are. I can then go down and fix them. It's not something you have to do, just an approach. So there's no real best approach here. The key is let them know there are issues, identify what those issues are, facilitate quick navigation to fix those issues, and resubmission of the form. Questions on validation, error recovery? These are the places you're going to spend the most time testing. Interaction things, menus and complex interactions and forms. With those types of interactions comes something called freakout mode. It's not really what it's called. It's the best term I can come up with. Freakout mode occurs when a screen reader is reading an element and that element is either modified or destroyed, removed from the page. So the screen reader is reading something. If it changes or goes away, screen reader kind of freaks out. Says, I'm not sure what to do. The thing I was reading is gone. I don't know what. I guess probably I'll just start reading somewhere else. It's kind of what it does. Depending on the browser, it varies a little bit. It might just go back up the chain a little bit and read something close to where the content disappeared or changed, or it may go back to the very beginning of the page. So an example might be something like stock quotes that update every 30 seconds in a page. If I'm using a screen reader, every time I get to that stock quotes section, if I'm reading through it and it changes, freak out mode, right? I might either start here or I might go right back to the very beginning of the page. So usually you want to try to design or allow content updates to be user initiated. So instead of automatically refreshing the stock quotes, maybe there's an option or a link where I can either turn off auto updates or refresh to get the new update. So make it so I initiate it. If you do it that way, there's no way you can get freak out mode. If I'm on a refresh link and the content updates below it, there's no way I can be in that content when it refreshes. Just the only way it refreshes is if I activate the link. So freak out mode is impossible. So that's a great approach to this. Doesn't always work. Sometimes we have content that has to update. Another example of freak out mode, dialog box. Okay, I activate a dialog box. Usually when I activate a dialog box, I would want to set focus to that dialog box so I know that something has happened, right? If I'm reading through a page and there's a little question mark, more information link, I activate more information with the screen reader and a dialog box opens. If you don't set focus to that dialog box, I'm still at the more information link. I'm going to sit there and hit enter. Why am I not getting more information? Well, you are. It's just purely visual in the page. You would want to set focus to that dialog. Okay, so no real issue there with freak out mode. Let's say I read through the dialog and there's a close link or close button. If I activate close, dialog disappears. What just happened? Freak out mode, right? The thing I was reading is gone. So what do you do in that case? Typically you'd use scripting and set focus back to the link that opened that dialog. Okay, so this is something that occurs a lot with these types of interactions, and it's something you have to test with the keyboard. It's something that is best tested with screen reader, and it's sometimes hard to tell that it's an issue because sometimes it just freaks out to the right place. It just happens when that element destroys or changes, it just happens to revert focus to someplace that kind of seems logical when you're testing it. Okay, does that make sense? And so sometimes it doesn't look like there was anything wrong, but it potentially could be. And you want to test across browsers. Generally, if you test in IE freaks out more than other browsers. Surprise, surprise. Right, and usually in IE, if you experience freak out mode, it usually goes back to the very top of the page. Other browsers might just go back up the DOM chain a little bit until it finds content that's still there or has not changed. So testing in IE is a good test here. Again, you can use JavaScript and Focus or ARIA to avoid or control that freakout mode. You want to know how to use tab index 0 and tab index -1. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but it allows things besides links and form controls to receive keyboard focus. So the example of the dialog box, you activate more information, a dialog box opens. By default, only links and form controls can receive keyboard focus. I can't tab to a dialog box. If I set focus to a dialog box with JavaScript, by default it can't receive keyboard focus because it's not a link or a form control. If I give it a tab index value of -1, it can receive keyboard focus. Okay? So anytime you have a dialog box or anything other than a link or form control that you're setting focus to, you probably want to make sure it has a tab index of -1. That says allow this thing to receive programmatic keyboard focus, typically with the focus function in JavaScript. Tab index of 0 says place this thing in the default keyboard navigation order. Even though it's not a link or a form control, allow the user to tab to it. Okay. Not too many use cases for tab index equals 0. There are actually a few on your site. We'll probably get to them in just a minute. But maybe really important instructions in the middle of a form. Consider a form that has a whole bunch of form controls. Usually a screen reader user or keyboard user is going to hit tab, 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 and go through all of the form controls. What if in the middle of the form you have some really important instructions? Well, if I'm just hitting the tab key, I just jump right over those important instructions. Maybe if you give those instructions a tab index of 0, I can tab to that, read the instructions, then continue on. So it kind of makes anything, a paragraph, a div, Anything that normally would not receive keyboard focus allows it to receive keyboard focus in the default order of the page, as if it were a link or form control. It also allows you to have things besides links or form controls become functional or interactive. Right? I can click on a div and trigger JavaScript on click. I can't do that with the keyboard. I can't click on a paragraph of text with the keyboard unless it receives focus. The only way a paragraph can receive focus is if it has tab index of 0. So, kind of a weird use case. Usually, if you're going to have interactive things, you want them to be default interactive things, links or form controls. The tab index allows you to do some other things. Another thing you want to test with, tab index equals -1. If it will so tab index of -1, as I mentioned, allows things to receive programmatic focus. I can set focus with JavaScript to them, but by default, they will not be in the default tab order of the page. So if you add tab index equals -1 to a link or a form control, you will not be able to tab to it in the order of the page. Okay, that was an example of this. Another site that we evaluated that you're familiar with. I know there's this little rivalry thing between you and them. It starts with an E, ends in Bay. Their website at one point had the register and login links, for some reason, had tab index equals -1. So, I don't know why, but that removed them from the keyboard tab order. That means if you were a keyboard user, you could not tab to register or log in, which essentially made the rest of the site worthless. That was a long time ago. We won't hold it against them, and it was fixed quickly. But those are things you need to be careful with. That'd be really hard to. You wouldn't be able to detect that unless you were doing keyboard testing. If you just look at it, even if you looked at the markup, you would probably miss that. You've got to test with the keyboard to catch these types of things. Especially with dialog boxes, alert messages, dynamic elements. Those are things to just check with your keyboard. Which brings me to the next thing, and that's ARIA design patterns. And this really goes beyond ARIA to just interaction patterns. Users expect certain things to work certain ways, right? A select menu should work a certain way. A checkbox, if I tab to a checkbox, I should be able to hit the space bar to check or uncheck that checkbox. Things have their default behaviors. In ARIA, what ARIA allows us to do is it allows us to build really cool interactions and controls and present the meaning and type of control to the user in a way that's very standard. So an example might be a slider, right? There's no slider element in HTML, so we hack together a slider using CSS and scripting, and we build this thing. If you click on it, you can drag something from 0 to 100, right? And you can make that keyboard accessible, so I can tab to it, maybe hit the left and right or up or down arrow keys to move the slider. But how do you present that to a screen reader user? When I tab to a slider, how do you present to the user, hey, this thing is a slider, and you should use the arrow keys to navigate, to move it up or down? That's really hard because there's no built-in semantics in HTML that support that. With ARIA, we can. We can add role equals slider to whatever the thing is that we built. When I tap to it, now the screen reader says, hey, this thing's a slider. You can add other ARIA attributes that identify a maximum value, a minimum value, a current value. Those would all be presented accessibly to the screen reader user. That makes sense? It allows us to do things that are not default sliders that you hack together to make a slider, but now I can make it accessible as a slider to a screen reader user, which is really, really pretty cool. Now, I always want to use standard HTML when I can, but when I can't, I want to use add that ARIA in there. Well, in ARIA, there are default what they call design patterns for interactive controls. So it says if you build a slider, the user should interact with it in this way. The up arrow key moves it, increments the value up. The down arrow key increments the values down. The home key moves it to the maximum value. End key moves it to the minimum value. Right? It outlines, if you build a slider, this is what you need to program into that slider so the user can expect it to work the way it should. And there are design patterns for, let me just pull them all up here. Whoop. Design patterns for many things in ARIA. Okay, these are some of the things that you can build with ARIA that will provide the default semantics in the interaction to screen reader users. Accordion. Okay, you've seen things that kind of slide out, in and out. Accordions, alerts, we talked about alerts, autocomplete widgets. Right, you start typing a search term, you get the pop down of suggested terms below it. You can make those accessible. We build those all the time with scripting, but now the screen reader can know, hey, this thing has autocomplete. It has 12 recommended items that I can then use the arrow keys. So the design pattern says if you build an autocomplete, give it these roles, give it these attributes, and you have to program the keyboard interaction. ARIA doesn't change behavior. Okay, ARIA will not make your autocomplete keyboard accessible. You have to do it. You have to program it that way. But the design pattern says this is the way that you build it so that the user would interact with that autocomplete in the standard way. Down arrow keys would go through possible options. The enter key would activate that item that I've picked from the autocomplete. Anyways, you can see there's a whole bunch of types of things that you can build. Menus, this is a big one. This is one that you are and will be using on your site. It's for complex menus, especially ones that have multiple levels of menus that you would interact generally with the keyboard. So down arrow key, right arrow key to expand menus, left arrow key to move back. Escape key would move you back up a menu level. It tells you this is how you build it, this is how you build the interaction. These are the roles and attributes that you add for it to be fully accessible to the screen reader user. So there's a bunch there. This does not cover everything. This does not cover every type of interaction that you would build, but there's a good set of design patterns for you to follow. It's real important, though. If you build a menu, you want to make it accessible. If you add the ARIA to identify the thing as a menu, it will be presented to a screen reader user as a menu. And often the screen reader will give additional cues. So, for example, with role equals menu, when you activate a menu item, the screen reader will say something like, menu, use the up and down arrow keys to move through items, something like that. I can remember the exact wording. Well, if you have programmed your menu to work with the left and right arrow keys instead of up and down, we now have a mismatch between what you've programmed and what the user is expecting. Not only what they're expecting, but what they were just told by their screen reader to do. So you've got to follow the design patterns. Okay? And you want those types of interactions to be consistent throughout the site. Okay? There are a lot of different ways you can program a simple menu. You've got these on your site, right? You've got this help menu, right? See that? I mouse over this thing, it pops down, I get items. This thing, I click on it, and it gives me different types of items. Right? So there's two menus that are kind of interacted with a little bit differently. I'm not saying that you have to program these exactly the same, but when you have the same type of interactions, the user, especially throughout your site, is going to expect the same interaction behavior. If I open a dialogue, all dialogues should open the same way, focus should be set to the same place, and I should be able to close them the same way throughout the site, right? So coming up with good patterns, and as you do QA and testing, you want to look for these things. Okay, here's one menu that works this way, here's another menu that works some way totally different. Technically, both are accessible. Technically, both may implement ARIA correctly, but both are menus, yet they function differently. So consistency is just so vital for these types of things. Questions on that so far? I know we're kind of skimming over ARIA a little bit. There's just so much in ARIA. We could spend a whole day just talking about ARIA implementation. But for testing, the idea is it should be presented consistently and in a logical and intuitive way. It's important to understand element default roles. ARIA has a whole bunch of roles that we can add to elements in HTML, but most HTML elements already have a default role. Okay? So something like input type equals checkbox has a default role of checkbox. You don't need to add role equals checkbox to a checkbox, because it already is one, right? At the same time, you can change things. You could do something like input type equals checkbox, role equals radio button. So now, yeah, some people are saying, well, why would you do that? You probably wouldn't, but you can, and that's the key. The rules for ARIA are pretty loosey-goosey. So you'd have a checkbox that is presented to a screen reader user as being a radio button. You'd see how that'd be very confusing to them. They would try to interact with it as a radio button, meaning up and down arrow keys to cycle through options, when actually it interacts as a checkbox. It is a checkbox, which would use a spacebar to activate items. So be really careful and understand the default roles. So kind of an example here of some things you can do. Let's say you have a submit button on your site. Really bad, really inaccessible would be to add an image in your page and give it an on-click event handler. What would be the issue with that for a submit button? Yeah, I can't tab to an image, right? So I could never actually, using a keyboard, get to that image to be able to activate the on-click event to submit that form. What's that? Yeah, that'd be another case. I'm not going to really talk about non-Java. Really, whether to require JavaScript or not is really not an accessibility issue, more of kind of a general usability issue. But it's something you want to consider for sure. But yeah, so this would be really bad because I cannot activate that button using the keyboard. Now, one thing you could do is you could add tab index equals 0 to that image, right? That would now place it in the keyboard flow. So that might be a little bit better. You would actually have to do some additional scripting. You'd have to detect the enter key in the space bar. Not all browsers trigger on-click for elements that have tab index of 0. Anyway, next thing you could do is you can put that image inside of a link. Well, that works pretty well. Now I can tab to that image, and that works okay. The issue is that now that's being presented as a link, right? Remember the case that it says search link or link search. Well, it's not really a link. It's a button. So we could add role equals button to that link. Now we've changed the semantics. The screen reader would now read submit button. Okay, that's really pretty accessible. But if we've gone through all that effort, why don't we just use a button? Right? We have something native in HTML that does the job. So let's start with that. The issue here, even though this and this would be presented exactly the same, well, they would be presented the same, except what if I have something that doesn't support ARIA? Okay, this would still be presented as a link if I use it in an older browser or an older screen reader. This will always work. So let's use the native HTML thing that does the job. When that doesn't work, then we'll use ARIA to enhance it. Okay. A few other things on ARIA roles. We talked about the default role for checkbox. Default role for button is button, so it doesn't make sense to add those. It doesn't really break anything, but I don't know. It's kind of a waste, really, to add those redundant roles. Redundant roles may be useful, however, in HTML5. Things that are not yet fully supported. Examples might be nav, role equals navigation. ARIA support is pretty good in screen readers for role equals navigation. They all support it. None of them support the nav element yet. Okay. So for right now, kind of short term, you probably want to do nav and role equals navigation. Up the road a little bit, we just change it to nav as soon as screen readers start supporting nav by default. Questions? Are your brains full? Kind of a lot of stuff, isn't it? So let's actually dig in and start playing with a few things. Okay, I'm going to go on your site and start checking some keyboard accessibility. Okay, so that's pretty easy, right? Take your mouse, put it away. All right, we only got our keyboard. If you are using a Mac, do note that you probably will have to enable an option in the settings to enable full keyboard accessibility in web pages. Okay, there's a preference in the Mac, the OS settings, to turn on full keyboard accessibility. By default, it won't navigate to links in a page, only through form controls. So you'd have to turn on that option to test if you're using a Mac. So I'm going to, just starting at the beginning of the page, start hitting the tab key. So I'm on the logo. That's probably a good start already. It's a good logical place for me, the first thing to be navigated to at the page, to be at the top of the page visually. And there's the focus indicator. Great. I hit tab key. Again, there's the skip to main content link. I would want to test that, right, and make sure it works. Hit the enter key. I already did that when we saw that it did work. And I can continue on using the tab key. Again, good focus indicator. I can visually see where I'm at within that page. I hit tab again, it opens up this help menu. if I continue to hit tab, it cycles through the options in that help menu. If I hit tab again, the menu automatically closes and continues to the next link. Okay? Accessible, right? That really works pretty well. I can get to all of the items in that menu. Question you might ask is, the advantage of having the help menu for a mouse user is that I don't have to look at or go through those items until I activate it with the mouse, but this is forcing the keyboard user to navigate through all those items. Okay? I'm not saying that's bad. It's just kind of interesting that the behavior is a little bit different. You see what the difference is there? Now, in this case, we're talking about 6 links. It's not very much. If you had a really complex drop-down, fly-out menu and I had to hit tab key 100 times, that would be a much different story. Usually in those cases, you would only make the main menu items keyboard accessible. I could then hit enter on the main menu items to either go to a page for that area of the site or maybe open the menu and then interact with the menu. You want to be pretty equitable, right? If mouse users don't have to interact with it until they do interact with it, you probably wouldn't want to force keyboard users through it. This is a very minimal thing. One other thing that's a little interesting, again, it's not bad. If I go to Security Center, well, let me back up a little bit. I'm navigating with my keyboard. Say I'm a screen reader user, and I hear switch to Classic PayPal, and I hit tab, and then I say, oh, that's the link that I wanted. I want to go back to Classic PayPal. So I hit Shift Tab, and where am I? I actually am on the help link itself. I hit Shift Tab again, and it starts going back over here. So I go forward, and it starts navigating through the... Not a big deal. It just could be a little bit odd, especially if it's pretty easy if I'm a sighted user, I can see what's going on, but a screen reader user might wonder, why am I getting different navigation elements moving forward versus navigating backwards? So you would think the solution then is if I hit Shift Tab right here is to have switched to Classic PayPal, then I navigate backwards through the links, but now I'm back to that first problem, right? I'm adding additional navigation elements that mouse users don't have to interact with by default. I'm being really, really nitpicky, okay? And I'm doing that on purpose. But these are the types of questions you have to ask as you're doing this type of testing. What is this going to be confusing? Is it especially going to be confusing if I can't see it on the screen? Okay. So another solution to that might be just not automatically open the menu, just only have help be the option, and maybe I hit enter and it opens the menu. Now I can tab through those. If I hit tab or escape in the menu, in this case it closes. That's going to be a case. Remember we talked about freak out mode. If I'm in that menu and I hit the escape key and the menu goes away, has freak out mode just occurred? Can be a little bit hard to test. If I hit tab again, it goes to Security Center. Well, maybe Firefox, that's what I'm using around. Maybe Firefox just freaked out correctly or randomly got me in a place that seems logical. I'd want to test that across browsers to be absolutely sure that freak out mode isn't occurring, and to make sure it always works correctly. When I hit escape, I should probably set focus back to some place that made sense. In this case, it would be the help menu itself. Right? If I hit escape when in the menu, focus goes back to the help menu that was used to open that. It's usually, almost universally the case. If you hit escape in an element, you go back to the parent element that was activated to open that item. Okay. Okay, so anyway, pretty minor things here. Search kind of pointed out the contrast thing there. One thing that's a little interesting, I hit tab here. I'm actually on a submit button that's not visible in the page. So this is a case where I've hit tab, but there's no visual indication as to where I'm at in the page. There's actually a button in here that's hidden that's used to submit that. It's actually really useful for a screen reader user. But for a sighted keyboard user, it's not a big deal. It's just a little bit weird. You've made the decision to not have a submit button visible in this search form. So that design made that. I see some people bashing their heads. So there's a no submit button, which I don't know. For me, there are arguments for it. It seems cluttered. There's some users that, regardless of disability, are probably going to look for a button. In fact, I just read a recent study about that. In fact, I actually read a study about labels inside the controls too, and some of the issues that come with those. So,
Silent budge on that either.
yeah. Like I said, you fight the right battles. This probably isn't one, but there is an issue there. I'm in the search box. If I hit tab, focus is actually on a hidden button that I can't see. If I hit tab again, it's now to summary, activity, settings. I was going to see real quick. This is kind of more of a usability thing. Usually with these types of things, if you mouse over them, you get some sort of indication that they're actionable. Right, I get the finger, right? So I love to call it the finger. But usually I get some sort of glow or highlight or maybe underline on those, and that would be useful also for keyboard users, right? I get the focus indicator, part of it's kind of chopped off, so I can maybe enhance that a little bit, and that'd be useful for everybody, mouse users included.
The next version has it already built.
Okay, cool. Now I'm down here in the left-hand menu. And I'm at this item here, and I can, first of all, there's an indication that it can expand and collapse, a visual indication. You will want to make sure that that is also presented to a screen reader user. In this case, it is. It's done with ARIA expanded. So there's ARIA expanded equals true, ARIA expanded equals false. In a screen reader, when you activate that, go to that link, if it has that appropriate ARIA attribute, it will, depending on the screen reader, JAWS will read collapsed or expanded based on the value. So if ARIA expanded equals true, it says expanded. ARIA expanded equals false, it says collapsed. So this would read something like link money at PayPal expanded. So I know, okay, hey, I'm on a link, and there's something here that's been expanded probably below. That's great for accessibility, right? You would want to check this with your keyboard. If you activate it with the Enter key, does it change? You would also want to check in a screen reader to make sure that the expanded value is being changed appropriately. In this case, it does, right? If I collapse or expand that, the screen reader generally will toggle. It'll say, collapsed, expanded, collapsed, expanded. So it's going to give you the indication as to what the current state is. This tools thing that pops up, you would want to make sure that that's also keyboard accessible. Okay. Now this is really good. Often we see these types of controls that are only mouse sensitive, right? I mouse over and that thing shows up, which it does. But the fact that it is also keyboard accessible is great. Right? That's awesome. I can get to that thing using both the mouse and the keyboard. And I can continue to navigate through these items. Okay, same thing here. You want to check with the keyboard, make sure it will expand and collapse. This little tools menu, again, is keyboard accessible. Now here's kind of an interesting one. This one has a flyout menu. Now there's a visual indication that there's something that may pop out to the right if I activate that thing with the little arrow. You would want to make sure that that's also conveyed somehow to a screen reader user. There are a few ways you might do that. You might use ARIA expanded or collapsed. There's also ARIA has pop-up, which would indicate, hey, here's an element that has a pop-up. Usually the screen reader will read something like has pop-up or pop-up, something like that. So you want to check this in the keyboard as well. Hit the Enter key. Whoops, I actually went to the wrong one. That's okay. Here we go. If I hit the Enter key, does it open up that dialog? Now a few things happened here. When I activated that link, a dialog opened. You would want to make sure that you set focus to a place that is logical. If it's purely a visual dialog that opens, but focus maintains at that link, if I'm a screen reader user, I just keep hitting Enter. I don't know that anything has happened. In this case, focus is set up here to this close icon at the top right. So the first thing that's read when I open that is something like link close. I would probably argue in this case that setting focus to the dialog itself would make the most sense. Now in order to do that, it has to have tab index equals -1, so it can receive and maintain that keyboard focus. Then it would just start reading through the content of the page. Now this is really kind of cool. If I hit tab key again, it goes down here to this update link. For some reason, at least in Firefox, it looks like it's been fixed. There's not much of a focus indicator there.
Yeah,
so
we've caught that, and that's being addressed. And the other thing I wanted to say was, Yeah, we're moving towards focusing on the container rather than like the first element of the query. So
Cool.
we are working in that direction.
Cool. Okay, and if I hit tab again, it goes back to close. Tab again, down to update. And then you want to check this in the screen reader, read the contents, make sure the order is logical. So great. Yeah, sounds like you're well on top of these things. Another thing that's interesting to note with this that you probably find more in a screen reader is that the first thing that is read is the close button for that dialog. Visually, if you consider the flow, when that dialog opens, you're probably going to read it and then close. Right? But the keyboard and screen reader interaction is close first, then read the content after. You can maybe just do a little code restructuring to move that close icon to the end of the dialog, set focus to the dialog, visually still have it in the top right, but at the end of the code. So then I read through, and now I get close and can activate it. It'd probably be a little more intuitive. Technical accessible versus functional accessible. Technically, yeah, that works. You can close it. Could probably be made a little more efficient.
So the link that opened that read the link and it opened it, but you're saying there was no ARIA or anything indicating what it does. So you suggest adding the pop-up or what?
Yeah. On this one, I'd probably add ARIA has pop-up just to indicate it. If there's no other ARIA there, I'm going to expect that to take me to another page. It doesn't. It just opens a dialog, which is essentially a pop-up. So I'd probably add ARIA has pop-up to that. You could do, well, no, you really can't. This would not be an appropriate place for like a menu, role equals menu, because this really isn't a menu. It's a dialog. A menu is just navigation elements. And sometimes that gets fuzzy. Sometimes you have menus that have content inside the menus, and sometimes menus inside of menus, and pop-ups inside of menus, inside of pop-ups inside of menus. And you have some really complex interactions, and you just sometimes have to hack it together. Yeah, ARIA has pop-up there, and I can activate close, and really awesome. I close the dialog, focus was set back to the link, then open it. Yes, this is where most things fell spectacularly. Just what would happen otherwise if I didn't set focus? Freak out mode, yeah. And we want to avoid freak out mode, right? Probably go back to the top of the page in this case, and I'd have to go back through.
Can you open up the file?
This?
Yeah, so the focus on is that
Close.
Yes. So it's be there or should it be on?
It should probably be on the entire dialogue.
So
Yeah.
If it's around it, then, I mean, if it's on that file, if I tap again, where should it go?
It would probably go into the content itself. If I hit tab, it'd go to the first link in the content, which I think should probably be update. If there were links here, it would just go into the content, but probably update, then tab again would take you to close. Okay? That's how I would probably do it. The fact that closes first isn't a real big deal, but setting focus to the dialogue itself. Another thing that you can do with the dialogue is this is probably just one big div. You can turn off the focus indicator. If you don't want a dotted line to surround that thing when it's open, you could add outline of 0 to that div, because it's pretty obvious. I just activated the thing that's open. I know visually, I know, hey, this is where I'm at because it just flew open in my face, right? So I could turn it off if I don't want the dotted line. It's a little bit ugly, I admit that. The other thing that you could do on that div is you could add an ARIA labeled by that points to maybe Zion's Bank. And it would read something immediately when focus is set, the screen reader would read something like Zion's Bank. Okay, so that gives the screen reader user kind of an initial context change. When I open the dialog, if I just set focus to a div, nothing would probably be read. If I give it a label, the label would be immediately read. So that tells me something happened. I activated a link, something happened because the screen reader immediately starts reading. Might be something. The downside of that approach is when I have my screen reader start reading, it would read Zion's Bank again, because it's the first thing in that page. So a little bit of a trade-off. Either of those would work fine. Now, of note is if I keep hitting the tab key, notice it just cycles between these two links. This is being treated as a modal dialog, okay? Keyboard modal. For a mouse user, however, if I click away from it, notice that it closes. I kind of debated this a little bit. It's a little bit different interaction for mouse users and keyboard users. Generally, for things that are not mouse modal, usually what would happen is if I hit tab, tab, when I hit tab again, if it's not a modal dialog, it should probably close the dialog and set focus back to the niche link, probably the Visa link, right? That's probably the behavior that I would expect to have happen here. Does that make sense? I'm kind of trapping the keyboard user into this until they physically close it. Now I can hit the escape key and it does the same thing, which is great, awesome. But I'm kind of trapping the keyboard user in there until they actually close it. Whereas mouse users, if I just go somewhere else in the page, click, it goes away. Again, I'm being really, really picky here. But I would maybe set it up that way. If I read through and tab through, after I get through the dialog, I'd probably automatically close and go down to the niche link in the page. Might just be a little more, maybe a little more friendly. Difference is pretty negligible. Okay. All right. Let me check my notes, see if I missed anything here. Okay, got all of those. Okay, if I hit tab here, we'd want to check keyboard accessibility. Again, this is an ARIA expanded and collapsed, right? And that seems to work. Okay. Now, if I hit tab right here with the notifications open, notice it sets focus to that piece of text. Now, that's not a link or a form control. It actually is an element that has tab index equals 0.
Let's move on. Okay. I had many issues with notifications.
Yeah. Now,
You're probably waiting for notifications.
that might be.
That whole section wasn't implemented in line with the rest of the.
Yeah. So it's not a big deal. It's just, I mean, well, it might be important. I guess what you have to do is weigh the importance. Is it important that the user navigating, if there were a notification, or if there isn't a notification in this case, that they get that as they're navigating through the page? It might be important enough to put that in the tab order. Leave it how it is. It's just a little bit odd because it's just kind of a piece of content that generally is. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that argument. Yeah. So anyway, that's just for whatever that's worth there. And same thing here. You would want to make sure that you can expand and collapse. I can go to see all. You'd want to check it. This was another thing that was a little bit interesting. That would be. I'm glad. It sounds like I'm validating a lot of things here, which is great. And this is for their benefit mostly. If I hit tab right here, the first thing that receives keyboard focus is this options menu. And it actually reads that. The word that's read by a screen reader that's in that is actually the word option. So it reads something like link option, and then I can hit the enter key to activate that. I can tab into that dialog. I can hit the escape key to close it, and focus is set back somewhere. Oh, I think that was a freak out mode. See how focus jumped back over here? Into the sidebar. Maybe I did something weird. So if I open, tab, escape, yeah. Actually, see, focus went over their designs bank. This looks like a scripting issue. It's probably like kept track of the last thing that it should set focus to when something closes, but that variable probably wasn't updated when I opened this, so it's going back to the last thing that it should have set focus to. That's probably a scripting issue rather than a freak-out mode issue. So something I hadn't noticed before. See how important this keyboard testing is? If you were a screen reader user, that could be really confusing. Okay, now I'm back to this link, kind of a random place in the page. You never detect that probably otherwise. But the short version of this is that the option menu is in the keyboard and reading order before the content that it applies to. So the first thing I hear is an option menu that I can open, but I don't really need options for what. And then I keep reading, and it would read this stuff. Then it would read the next option menu. There's just that potential for a disconnect or confusion as to which option menu goes with which one. Am I doing an option on this, on the content below, or an option for the content above? In this case, this text right here is a heading. It's, I think, an H3, which would suggest if we have H3, then a link, then some text, then an option menu, then down here another H3, that suggests that this option menu is in the section that belongs to that heading, when actually it's not. It's the previous one. See how there's a little weird thing there? I think just a little code restructuring to put the option menu probably after this text, keep it visually presented where it's at, would alleviate that. It's in the heading section. It comes after the content. And in keyboard testing identifies that. Screen reader testing would also identify those types of issues. Okay. Okay, and we talked about how flows there. And then you would want to just navigate through the rest of the items, make sure everything is keyboard accessible. As they pointed out before, you can see good clear focus indication and underline for those items there. Bottom menus, you can see they do become underlined when they receive keyboard focus. So.
Jared, I do know that one of the pages you looked at, they did have a visible indicators. Like when you were looking at before.
Oh.
Settings. I think that's the issue where I could go to the settings tab. Because I know you were here back some of your examples for that. No, we're good.
Yeah, it's there. You mean?
Yeah, once you activate that.
Okay. It's going to log me out. Sure. Knew it. How many times do you log into PayPal every day? I'm just curious. It's got to be like 1 million. Oh, Activity 10 has the old presentation. Maybe weird. Oh.
But there was one where I saw that.
Wow. Beta, right? Yeah, the activity one. We didn't look at that. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So, okay. So, any questions about kind of basic keyboard testing? We kind of threw in a lot of screen reader type stuff in there as well, but that really kind of leads us to our next point, which is checking a screen reader. Screen readers are kind of complex, nasty, icky beasts. How many of you used a screen reader before? Okay, well, about half of you. Great. They're pretty complex to learn. They're pretty complex pieces of software. They're buggy. They're weird, but they're screen readers. If you're blind, they're awesome. Okay, I mean that's just the way that accessibility is provided. It can really drive sighted users, especially QA people that don't rely on them every day. That can drive us a little bit mad, but they're really useful for testing. People ask us a lot, do I have to test in a screen reader? And it really depends on the content. If you have really basic HTML content with no real interaction, no need for ARIA, you can be reasonably assured if you do the rest of this stuff that it's going to be pretty accessible, right? It's when you get into the things like the interactions, possibility for freak out mode, when you get into ARIA that's been implemented, scripting, then it becomes more necessary to test in a screen reader, at least to ensure screen reader accessibility. So when you do basic testing, you really want to focus on navigation, forms, document structure, and then dynamic content or interactions, widgets, things like that. On the WebAIM site, we have tutorials for JAWS, NVDA, and VoiceOver. Those are the most common screen readers. JAWS is a commercial screen reader. It's about $1,000 for a license for it. I think you have access here to JAWS if you want to do testing in JAWS. It is the most common screen reader. NVDA is a free open source screen reader. You can download it. It's Windows only, free. You can use as much as you want, and it's improving in features all the time. It's really becoming more and more very robust screen reader for most web content. That's kind of what we recommend people do initial testing in. If you're doing real complex stuff, you might want to test across multiple screen readers, but for most things you're going to be testing, NVDA is going to be very sufficient to do the testing that you need. And then VoiceOver comes on all Macs. So if you have a Mac, you have VoiceOver. If you have an iPod, iPad, or iPhone, I've lost my phone, here it is, you have VoiceOver. Okay? So you enable that in the settings. You can do basic evaluation just using your phone or your iPad. enable VoiceOver and have it read the page. It will identify alternative text. It will give you the reading and navigation order. You can check form labeling, form accessibility, document structure. If you have have iOS 5, especially iOS 5.1, has pretty good ARIA support. So ARIA's support is built into VoiceOver, even on the phone. In fact, ARIA support on the iPhone right now is better than VoiceOver's ARIA support on the desktop. Quite a bit better. So I'll show you in just a minute. So anyway, use any of those. There are other screen readers, but for you, you're probably not going to be doing really heavy-duty, in-depth testing. It's maybe nice to find the screen reader person that can do that type of stuff for you. And you've got people that are good at this. For you, it's going to be basic testing, reading. Are there major issues that are coming out just from listening and interacting and navigating in that page? Try testing without the mouse, and if you can, turn off that monitor, look away. Just listen to it. Sometimes if we are listening to the screen reader while reading, we think we hear what we see, when it's not actually what we see. And sometimes we I don't know, the order and the structure, when we see it, it makes sense. But if you just listen to it, you realize, there's some things that we could probably do to enhance structure and content to make it more accessible to screen reader users. Don't worry about pronunciation, the way screen readers read things. If they can form a word out of it, it'll try to form a word and pronounce it however it thinks it should based on the logic that's built in. Don't worry about that. Don't try to hack a screen reader to make it read the way you think it should read or to read appropriately. Screen reader users are used to that. They're used to those quirks and sometimes inconsistencies. And sometimes it is the screen reader's fault. You need to be real careful if you're identifying issues. If you identify a screen reader issue, that's fine, but you probably want to verify, make sure it's not a screen reader issue. Maybe test in multiple screen readers. It takes a little bit of knowledge to figure out what the screen reader really supports and what it doesn't. But for basic evaluation, it can be really very, very valuable. So let's check in a screen reader. Let's do some playing. Now, I'm going to demonstrate in VoiceOver. And I'm going to do that for a couple reasons. One is that VoiceOver is really stable and it's pretty easy to use, and I can demonstrate it here. The other reason is that my Windows installation on my Mac totally died this week, and so I don't have Windows, so I can't demonstrate NVDA. The differences are, there are some notable differences, but for what we're going to test, it should generally work, with the exception that some of the ARIA things that have been implemented into the site are not yet fully supported in VoiceOver. Okay?
Do you want to use like one of our PCs?
Oh, do you want? Yeah, probably not for time. I'm just giving me a couple minutes here. So, sure, please.
ARIA thing is only applicable for HTML5 or?
No, good question. No, ARIA. Well, no, you can implement ARIA now. Even if you haven't moved to HTML5, you can and would want to implement ARIA now. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute with code validation. But yeah, you want to and can implement it now. So I'm going to go ahead and open up VoiceOver. Whoa, sorry. Okay, I'm going to drag our little caption box over here. Okay, I'm just going to do kind of the same thing I did with keyboard testing. You can combine keyboard testing and screen reader testing a lot. It's really helpful to kind of do two things at one time. I'm going to start hitting the tab key.
Google, search, leaving toolbar, visited link image, PayPal, list 5 items.
Okay, so it starts giving you information. Visited link, so I've already been there. Image, it's an image, then it reads the alternative text to PayPal. And this image is within a link that has 5 items, so it went ahead and identified that. I'm going to actually go to this page. We'll go with it. I just had some notes for some things on that page I was going to talk about for screen reader. But basically, you go through the same type of testing.
Leaving toolbar, visited internal link, skip to main content.
Okay, and you would want to check the skip to main content link. Now remember, internal pages don't work yet in VoiceOver. It sounds like maybe you'd implemented the focus hat, but you want to try to make sure that those work.
Link, personal link, business, visited link, my account, Help pop-up button. List 4 items.
Okay, now notice that said help pop-up button. So there's probably ARIA that's on that. Maybe ARIA has pop-up on that, I'm assuming, although that doesn't read somewhere else. Anyway, it knew somehow that that was a pop-up button.
Link. Help center. Link. Community help form.
Okay, we're going to go quickly here.
Link. Search box. Visited link. This internal link. Money at PayPal.
I think the menu, the help has role menu, might have role menu.
Oh, okay. Okay. So here I came to this link. I can expand and collapse, but notice that VoiceOver doesn't read. It doesn't yet support ARIA expanded. Yeah. I think it does on the iPhone now, but it doesn't in desktop Safari and VoiceOver. So.
Internal link. Banks, debit and credit cards.
Okay.
Link.
Just trying to see how that works. You can.
Visited link. Option pop-up button.
Okay. Notice that red option pop-up button. I'm going to just turn this down a little bit. Okay, and turn this one up. There we go. It shouldn't sound so bad now.
Link. Payment to W2E and My Design Services completed.
Okay, now this was something I noticed. This was on the history page as well, or the activity page. The link says completed. Visually you see completed, but there's some, I think, some hidden text that's in there that's reading the full description for that.
Option. Link. Payment to W2E and My Design Services completed.
See how it's reading all of that for the link? If I just have the screen reader read this,
Link. Payment to W2E and My Design Services completed. Option pop-up button. $64.95 USD. 04/20/2012. Heading level 4. Payment to W2E and My Design Services. Link. Payment to W2E and My Design Services completed. List 4 items.
can you see how we're getting some duplication of content there? I think there's either a title or some sort of off-screen content that's causing that to be read twice. So. Yeah, that might be the argument for that. Yeah, and you'll notice the reading order was, again, kind of a little bit weird, that it read the total, it read option, and then the dollar amount, and then the date, and then the text, and then completed. Just maybe a little bit weird there. Let me look at my notes, see if there's anything else. One thing I noticed on the activity page, this is what I was going to highlight, there's no skip to main content link on that page for some reason. That's another one of those things that you probably wouldn't find unless you were keyboard testing or screen reader testing, but I noticed when you tap through, there's no skip to main content link on that page. So, again, it's so important to test those things. Another thing that's real handy as you navigate through is you can hear form labels. On the activity page, there are several form labels that are hidden off screen. Visually, you look at them and they make sense, but there's off-screen labels that are read by a screen reader, but all of the words are truncated. There's like no spaces in there, so it reads, I didn't write it down, but it reads like one great big word, which doesn't really make sense. And so that'd just be a case of putting in the right, the right thing. That's something that's really hard to test. Even through automated tools, even with keyboard testing, if I hadn't checked that in a screen reader, I probably wouldn't have noticed it. It wasn't until the screen reader read, this word that didn't make sense, and I said, well, what is that word? And I realized, oh, it's kind of 4 words that are all put together with no spaces in between them. Another thing to watch for in screen reader testing is empty links. Okay, empty links typically would just read link or space, something like that. There were a couple on the activity page that I noticed. You hit tab and it just reads space. But it's actually an expand link, a little plus sign. You can click to expand and collapse, but it's an empty link. Anytime you have a link, that should contain text or alternative text that would be read by a screen reader. So, yeah.
So what about that completed link? So what do you suggest? What is that?
Well,
would it be better just to leave it alone? Or?
If you fix the content order so that it really is a heading, and so the thing is the heading, then the word completed. Did you hear the argument there? The idea is you put the off-screen text in the link, so if I'm navigating by links, it says completed, and then the description for that. That works. That helps there, but it does provide the duplication of content if I'm just reading through the page. I would probably argue to get rid of the duplicate text if you fix the reading order and have a true heading. All I have to do is navigate to the previous heading. In VoiceOver, I can do that. I can pull up a list of all the headings on the page. Okay. Notice it also indicates the heading level. So first level heading.
1. PayPal account summary. 2. Money at PayPal. 2. Banks, debit and credit cards. 2. Gift cards and special offers. 4. Payment to WebAIM Design Services.
Okay. So I can navigate and see. Oops, you can't see that. Let me pull it over here. There you go. You can see, you know, it indicates the whole heading level. I can filter this down. I can search. I can navigate by many different types of elements using a screen reader as well.
Links, 33 items.
Okay.
Are we missing 3?
What's that?
Are we missing 3?
Yeah.
7 items.
Yeah, oh, it keeps jumping back over here. But yeah, that's a good point. Notice there is no heading level 3. It jumped over that. This also suggests that these 3 headings, which are heading levels 4s, are part of the section about gift cards and special offers. That makes sense? These are subheadings to that H2, which isn't really appropriate. On this page, there really is no, this is gift cards over here. There really is no main content heading on this page.
So how it is with this heading?
How would it speak them?
How it is picked all the headings?
That's based on the markup. So that's an H1. These are H2s. Those are H4s. Yeah. So that's been dictated in the markup for the page. So in this case, this could maybe be a little bit better. Maybe by putting this might be a case for an off-screen heading at the beginning of this. I don't know, account summary would probably be appropriate. It might be even useful to have visually at the top of the page. See account summary. But if not, you could hide it. That would put an H2 right here of account summary. And then these H4s would be H3s below that. Okay? That'd probably be the best way. Another option might be to make that account summary an H1. Now this is an H1 right now, PayPal account summary, which I think is at the beginning of the page. So I don't know. A few different options there. The fact that the big bold text that are headings regardless of level is helpful. Right? I can still navigate to them. It's just the structure that becomes a little bit confusing. Questions about screen reader testing? How this works?
Dates, you just read a number instead of the regular date.
Oh, for those dates there, the 4/20/2012. Yeah, that.
It doesn't say like April.
No, it just read the dates. Screen readers do some of those types of things. It'll take things and try to make it a little more useful. Sometimes it fails spectacularly at that. It tries to be helpful. But usually what you see on the screen, it'll read it just as it's read. Yep. As I was noting, you can navigate by various elements.
Landmark, list 4 items.
Okay, so I navigate by landmarks, okay, which is really nice.
Link, payment to WebAIM
Whoops,
Design
whoop,
Services.
sorry, wait, there we go. I navigate by headings,
Links, 33 items.
links,
Landmarks, 8 items.
landmarks,
Table, 0 items.
tables, no tables.
0 items.
Web spots are a way of kind of, I can identify like bookmarks within the page that I can navigate to later. So if I know that this portion in the page is always where I want to check my account balance, I can navigate to it and kind of set a bookmark and then navigate to it later. It remembers that based on the page I'm at.
Form controls, 7 items.
Form controls
Headings, 7 items.
and headings again. Okay.
Link,
So I navigate by a lot of different things. That's another good test in the screen reader. Check the landmarks, check the headings, make sure the structure is all logical. Questions about that? Okay, last couple things here. Valid HTML and CSS. This supports accessibility. WCAG 2.0 has a requirement that basically says something really kind of nebulous, like your page should not have significant HTML or significant validation issues, whatever significant is. It's a little fuzzy. The idea is good code supports accessibility. You can be accessible, yet still have bad HTML code, right? You can have invalid HTML or CSS and still be accessible. And the vice versa is true. You can have totally valid HTML and CSS and be totally inaccessible, but there is some support between those. WCAG 2.0 again does require that you avoid significant accessibility issues. I don't know. My personal opinion on that, I'm not a real big fan of that requirement in WCAG because every instance that I've ever seen of invalid code that causes accessibility issues is already captured by another aspect of WCAG 2.0. Okay? So if you mangle your code and it causes a form label to not be labeled, well, that's a WCAG issue because you have an unlabeled form control. If you have bad code that causes alt text to not be associated to an image, well, you've violated something else in WCAG. So kind of what that does is it causes two failures when really the accessibility issue is really what matters. The fact that it's just invalid code doesn't really matter. If it's invalid and doesn't affect accessibility, why is it an accessibility failure? So I don't know. For whatever that's worth, I don't know what your requirements are for valid code. It's a great idea. For a development standpoint, for cross-browser compatibility, it's a great idea. It is part of WCAG 2.0. Do it, right? But be real careful to not maybe fight that battle. If it's accessible but not valid, or maybe has some accessibility issues and is not valid, let's fix the actual accessibility issues, not so much fight for valid markup. Yeah, and I want to talk about HTML5 and ARIA. If you implement ARIA right now and validate your page using the W3C validator, it will complain that the ARIA is not valid HTML. Now, if you use HTML5, HTML5 fully supports ARIA, but it is not supported in HTML4 or that's HTML as far as the validator goes. The W3C has basically said, yes, you can implement ARIA in HTML4. You can implement it in that's HTML and it will be valid. But we're probably not going to update the HTML spec or update the HTML validator to support that. So really what it comes down to is if your markup is valid and your ARIA is valid, valid plus valid equals valid, right? Even if the validator tells you that it's not valid in HTML or it's HTML. If you move to HTML5, it's fully supported in the spec and in the validator. So don't worry about the validator complaining about ARIA. It's a validator issue, not a validation issue. User testing. Are you guys involved with user testing at all with what you do? No. Okay. Okay, then I'll just cover this super quickly. No, I'm not. I'm just going to skip it for sake of time. Just accessibility testing is important, but have it be part of broader user testing is really what it comes down to. Okay, automated tools. There are really way too many to list. Auditing tools are best utilized in the remediation process. If you can spend a lot of money on auditing tools that'll check zillions of sites and tell you how bad your accessibility is. You say, wow, okay, well we've got issues, now what do we do? Right? It's a lot better to implement those types of tools maybe after you've already implemented accessibility. And then you say, well, what have we missed versus where do we start? Right? We need to have a better process, maybe put those resources somewhere else. You already have a great plan and are implementing good accessibility. There's really two types of tools, ones that can help you individually in evaluation and ones that can check your entire site. And the approaches and benefits to those can be separate, but no tool can replace good education. We recommend and would suggest the Wave tool. I know that you use this. How many of you use Wave? Okay, most of you. Wave.webaim.org, you can use the online version. We, however, would definitely recommend the Firefox toolbar. Oops, let me switch back to Firefox. With the Wave Firefox toolbar, you can simply activate a button and it will give you feedback about accessibility inline in that page. All of the evaluation happens within the browser itself and after styles and scripting have been applied, so it gives you a pretty good representation of what the end user will experience. So it injects these icons into the page that give feedback about accessibility. So green icons generally are accessibility features. Okay, here's some ARIA that has been implemented, form labeling. Yellow icons indicate potential accessibility issues or alerts. So this one says, hey, here's an H4 that is incorrectly ordered. So the previous heading up before that was an H2, so it's skipping a heading level. Blue icons are structural or semantic, so it identifies things like lists, headings, and so forth. You can open an icons key, which will give you feedback about all of the possible icons that Wave might show you in line. You can click on an icon to get additional information about that icon, why it's appearing, and learn more about what you need to do to address that particular issue if it shows up. So that's really the short version.
So what are the 3 errors?
Okay, this is something interesting. If I scroll through this, I actually don't see any red. Oh, they're down here at the very bottom. Okay, one thing you will want to use quite often in Wave is disable styles. So that's going to disable styles and linearize the page. So now I can go through and get a cleaner view of what's going on. And these icons are actually at the very bottom. They're images missing alternative text. I would suspect they're probably like tracking images. Probably the impact on accessibility is probably nothing or very negligible because they're going to be probably hidden anyways. So that's the basics of Wave. We are working on a new version of Wave. You can get a very early demo of this right now at 5.wave.webaim.org. We're going to cross our fingers and hope that it works. It's a beta, and our betas are like your betas, I think. They're not perfect. So 5.wave.webaim.org, and yeah, like I said, it might be like yours. So yeah, not pulling up. Oh. Interesting. It's actually there, but you can see that is interesting. It's not showing up. But the approach is a little bit different with the sidebar. We're working on it, very open to feedback from you guys. We're going to be launching a more full beta of this in just a couple of weeks, and a toolbar probably in a month or two, the Firefox toolbar. Much more of a lot of changes in the things that we're checking. Also note that there's contrast checking, so it'll give you feedback about contrast issues in your page. Some ARIA and HTML5 checking built into this as well, and you can go and get more details about all of the individual icons that appear within your page right in the sidebar. So hopefully a little bit easier and more powerful tool for evaluation. Okay, any questions that you guys have for me? I know we're done. We're over time, but I know that any hands raised are going to be the only thing between you and home. So, okay. Thanks. I'll stick around if you have questions. Thanks a lot.